Hello and welcome to our third Ask the Expert series. Today we're going to talk about SAP Cloud Identity Authentication and single sign-on. And when I say we, I actually mean Carsten, who's going to host our session today. So he's going to tell you everything there is to know, or at least based on the questions that you've submitted up front about SAP Cloud Identity and single sign-on. Before we get started, just as always, a couple of housekeeping questions, or a couple of housekeeping items, I should say. One is this session will be recorded as always. You will get a link to the recording directly from GoToWebinar as well as from Sean. He'll probably send out an email either today or later or tomorrow. If you have any questions that you would like to submit during the session, please use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. You might have to click on the little arrow icon on the side to expand it, and you can type in the question and we will answer those questions as well. But we highly recommend, for the next session at least, that you're hopefully going to join us. Please submit your questions up front so we can prepare for them. We can provide in-depth answers, and you can do that on xiting.com/asktheexpert. You can see the URL here on the screen. You can select the topic you want to submit the question for, type in your question, and we'll make sure we have answers to those questions during the next session. This is number 3, as I said. There's going to be a couple of more sessions coming up. You're going to see a list of those topics, upcoming topics, also on the very same page. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carsten, and he's going to introduce himself real quick and then guide you through or answer all of the questions that you have submitted up front. All right, Carsten, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Perfect. Then again, from my side, good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and also greetings to our customers and to our business partners who are online. My name is Carsten Old, and I have the pleasure to guide you through this webinar today. I'm working as a senior SAP security consultant and SAP trainer at Xiting in Germany. And my area of expertise is in the area of secure authentication and single sign-on for on-premise and cloud applications, together with multi-factor authentication, and also with integration into already existing solutions like an Active Directory Federation service or an Azure Active Directory and that stuff. And this is the third session of our Q&A expert series that deals with single sign-on and cloud identity authentication, or in short, IAS, which is one of the 2 components considered as the cloud identity services. So the second component in this space, the provisioning service, will be discussed in our session number 6. And also in the next webinar, for example, we talk about S/4HANA migration, answer your questions related to HANA database, and lastly also provide you with some best practices to handle your logs and events, and also how to integrate with your SIEM solution. The session is about asking questions. That should be clear now. So as a starting point, we have consolidated first questions that you have provided to us upfront. Those are the main ones. And we will answer them in this session. First of all, we have received lots of questions regarding the main explanation about what is SAP Cloud Identity Services. I will jump into that as a first step. And then talking also about some recommendations, some best practices related to single sign-on, also when it comes to a hybrid landscape, where it's not just a cloud, but also on-premise involved. Often we have also the question when to use SAP single sign-on version 3, so the on-premise SAP solution, compared with the Identity Authentication Service. I will try to answer and provide some, let's say, best practices and up-to-date know-how about this. And also a very interesting one, why do we need the Identity Authentication Service if we already have an existing SAML IDP? And that's often a question that is asked commonly, and I try to answer this in a little bit more detail and to explain also the authentication flow and the integration of the IAS to an existing identity provider. Lastly, some questions related to costs, to licensing, and also to tenant creation. So is it available for free? It's often an asked question when it comes to these two services, and also how to get in possession of such a tenant, of such a instance for this service. These are mainly the questions that we try to answer in this session. And also my colleague Mike will keep an eye on the chat also. So please use the GoToWebinar chat to ask questions. We will try to answer them. And if there's no time for all questions, we can answer them, or we cannot answer specific ones. We will also follow up on them accordingly. All right, let's start with the first question. What are the SAP Cloud Identity Services? Easily answered. Cloud Identity Services is a combination of two solutions that build at the end, it makes up the Cloud Identity Services in general. The first component is the so-called Identity Provisioning Service, which is the one on the left side, and the other is the Identity Authentication Service, or IAS, and these two are seen as building blocks of a hybrid identity and access management from SAP. And these two services are also standard services for user authentication and user provisioning in the cloud, and considered also as core security services, which at the end means that they are tightly integrated with a business technology platform and with many SaaS solutions, software as a service solutions from SAP. So the idea is to really pre-integrate those solutions with the corresponding tenants of your software as a service solutions. So whenever you purchase a software as a service solution from SAP, the idea is that you automatically receive a specific tenant for your handling, to your authentication, or to make sure that you can provision your users to those systems. In this way, you can establish and you can see those systems as a central instance used to control access to all your applications in the SAP Cloud universe. Yeah. So where IPS, the provisioning service, takes place of the user provisioning and the life cycle, and the identity authentication is then seen as a central authentication hub for all SAP applications. And in this role, it's mainly a SAML identity provider. The IAS is just seen as a identity provider in this space. Of course, you can combine it with the identity access governance, which extends those two services with additional compliance functions like risk and SOD checking, and workflows and business role management, privilege access management, and so on. So my colleague Alessandro and Martin already talked about this in the previous session. All right, I hope that makes sense. That answers the question, first of all, about what are the cloud identity services, and the most important thing is that they are consist out of the provisioning and the authentication service. Another question was about to provide some recommendations, some best practices when it comes to single sign-on. And here we like to come up with some general concepts that are valid for all applications at the end, regardless where they are operated. So here I've prepared just a simple slide where you can see a user, and that user needs to access different applications that are hosted either on-premise or in the cloud. So these applications are protected by for authentication. So if user needs to authenticate in a first step in order to be able to access this application. You can also see some recommendations for secure authentication. The first one is use token-based authentication instead of credentials. That means instead of providing login credentials for every single application that you can see on the right side, the idea is to delegate the authentication and to centralize it on a system that you have in your control, meaning you have a central issuer where you first have to authenticate, and where you have to authenticate the only one time. That's also the word single when it comes to single sign-on. So once you have to authenticate, of course, but at the end, this primary authentication in step one will allow you to provide your identity to the central system. From there, the central system can not only authenticate a user based on credentials, but for example, and it's more and more asked nowadays, perform some device checking, like, for example, are you accessing from a company managed device? Is it a known user? Is the access done in a specific time frame? And so on. So there are many rules possible to check together with the first authentication. Yeah, you can enforce multi-factor authentication and all that stuff. Finally, at the end, once you are authenticated, you receive a so-called single sign-on token, which is the one that the application now accepts instead of credentials. So this token at the end technically contains a key, and with that key, you can have access to your application without providing any login credentials. Based from that point of view, it is a single sign-on in step 3 to your cloud application or your on-premise applications. And whenever you have another application, for example, that enforces additional factor of authentication, additional security, like a passcode or one-time based passcode or even a biometric check, you can implement this in addition to your central token issuer, for example, by using the Identity Authentication Service. Together with these informations, I will also provide you some additional best practices when it comes to authentication in hybrid landscapes. First of all, it's very important to make sure that you cover really authentication for all your applications, meaning to perform really an inventory to understand how those applications work, which token formats they support, which may bring us also to the on-premise solution I will talk about in a while. So some of them may be only possible to integrate with the on-premise solution, but most of the, let's say, typical web or browser-based applications and also all the cloud applications, they are mainly based on SAML. That means we can easily integrate them with the Identity Authentication Service. So cover all your applications: business technology platform, software as a service, and on-premise. Focus on a single source of truth, meaning do not spread credentials across the landscape. Get rid of them wherever you can, meaning you have to do it on a central system. You have to consolidate all your identities on this central system. And from there, you should provide the primary authentication in order to get in possession of the token. You can centralize this, the authentication, and you can enable login or authentication from any device as well. So it's more and more nowadays also applications are accessed using either mobile apps or mobile devices, but also browsers. That's also impossible. Also centrally bundle and regulate access by having still an overview about which resources a user has access to, and having with this Identity Authentication Service, having a kind of a central policy enforcement point that really allows you to ultimately control access to applications or dictate additional factors of authentication. Like when you implement risk-based or multi-factor rules for specific applications, for specific conditions or users that are, for example, part of specific groups. So that is really a framework that you can use, and it's very flexible. And lastly, users should have the same authentication experience. That's really important. That should be true for on-premise and cloud. And that especially helps to protect against such kind of phishing attacks and other stuff where login screens are faked and so on. So it's really important to have a corporate identity, to have a look and feel that the users are aware about, and to make sure that really you always provide the same experience for the end user. These are mainly the recommendations and also best practices that you should try to keep in mind when it comes to single sign-on. And also together with this, we not only have our authentication service, but we also have our connected applications, maybe on-prem, maybe in the cloud. So make sure that you integrate with your existing IDM processes, because you need to provision users there. Users need to be created, need to be assigned with permissions, and all these must be done in a compliant way, meaning also you should think about IDM and IAG integration in your authentication concept. That's more or less some of the most important recommendations, and it sums up, let's say, our best practices for single sign-on in a hybrid space. Next question was when to use single sign-on 3 and when to use the SAP Identity Authentication Service. First of all, on the left side, you can see the SAP single sign-on on-prem solution that mainly is geared towards desktop clients, meaning it supports mainly the SAP GUI and all these RFC-based fat client tools, you know, analytics for Office and that stuff, that is mainly based on SNC and the secure login client. So this solution is still pretty much valid and required and will not be replaced by IAS. IAS at the end is to be seen as a technology and as a component for all applications that are HTTP based. So all browser based applications, also on-premise, of course, can be and should be connected to the Identity Authentication Service to centralize your authentication processes. So as a summary, it's always a combination of both solutions to provide really a secure access. And we recommend for these dialog RFC components to use SNC together with a secure login solution, maybe Kerberos, which is commonly used, or based on certificates. But then for all HTTP-based applications nowadays, you know, when it comes to your launchpads or other cloud applications or other on-premise web interfaces, try to outsource authentication really to all to your Identity Authentication Service, to a central SAML IDP, because you have pretty much more flexibility there. You can, for example, enforce MFA and all that stuff, which you can't with for example, with Kerberos. That's, for example, to really answer this question. And for your reference, I have just attached this picture together with the link to a blog from the PM of the product, Marco Sommer, that's talking about a reference architecture for this hybrid reference world. And yeah, here you can more or less see that pretty much both solutions have its use case. The blue line below, you can see the on-premise world where you have your SAP GUI and you access your NetWeaver-based applications either with Kerberos or certificates. But then you also implement your on-prem systems with SAML together with your cloud applications to a central identity authentication instance that you will then also in turn connect to your corporate IDP for identity federation. I will explain this in any case in more detail when it comes to the next question. Also, question we got is why do we need the Identity Authentication Service? And to answer this, you have to be sure about the topic that at the end all cloud applications, maybe software as a service applications like SAP Analytics Cloud, like the integrated business planning or others you can see on the right side. And also every business technology platform SAP account represent a SAML service provider at the end. So the standard authentication method is already SAML. And in many cases, the default identity provider is the SAP ID service that allows you to easily log in with your S user, you know, and then have some quick entry to the system, perform some initial setup, create some users and assign permissions. However, if you want to integrate with your employees, with your corporate users, there are some difference depending on the cloud application. If you take a look at the right side, for example, the solutions that are bundled with the Identity Authentication Service, here it is mandatory. So you can no longer connect these applications with an existing corporate IDP. That is more or less the answer. Why do you need the IIS? Because it's mandatory for the business technology platform and also for a growing number of SaaS applications. If you take a look at the left side, for example, for the SAP Analytics Cloud, you can still connect to IIS, but directly also with a any kind of existing IDP where you have a SAML trust established. However, it's no longer recommended to do this because the idea of SAP is, of course, to bundle all your cloud applications, and there may be a lot of cloud applications, and to create really the trust with your central identity services tenant, and then have one integration point, one, let's say, federation with your corporate IDP. That is the idea behind. If we take a deeper look at the, let's say, at the authentication flow, I've prepared this one slide which guides us, let's say, through the integration and also through the flow of authentication, because it can be very, very complex in its details. But yeah, let's first start. So here you can see on the left side a user, maybe an employee of your company, that wants to connect to cloud applications, to different cloud applications. And now to simplify access to these various cloud applications, you want to connect with your existing single source of truth. And that brings us to the corporate IDP on the right side, which is maybe already available. And for example, I'm using here Azure Active Directory, and this knows about all your identities already. So there are login credentials. It also offers security features, like conditional authentication and all these nice things. And it serves as a central system to check your identity and to really issue the required token, providing you access. Okay, so since many cloud applications will be used by your employees, you, of course, use the cloud identity services to consolidate provisioning and authentication processes for your cloud applications. Meaning all these cloud applications, in the best case, are configured and automatically, let's say, connected to your identity authentication tenant based on a trust relationship that sometimes you need to do manually by just performing one click, for example, in the BTP, or it is already pre-delivered when you purchase a specific SaaS application. And the idea is that once you have connected all your applications to the IIS, there is one connection to delegate the authentication to the corporate IDP. In this case, towards Azure ID, since the password of your employees is only stored here. So therefore, the check and automatically the access decision is made on the Azure side in this case. This integration also takes place via SAML, so it's called a SAML federation. So now we have the Identity Authentication Service, and this has its own user database. So this guy also has the ability to persist users and to handle different kinds of users. And that's often where the confusion starts. It is best practice to really persist users in the database. Yes, so for user provisioning, you may use a tenant of the provisioning service to write your identities from your single source of truth to your identity authentication tenant. This integration takes place via the SIEM standard. So the Identity Authentication Central User Store and Display, or this case, has an important role, meaning your employees that you persist there, they will be enriched with further attributes. It could be, for example, unique user identifiers and that stuff. And this really then creates a central user identity to access your entire cloud universe. That is more or less the idea behind. So changes to the life cycle, for example, of users in your Azure will be also mirrored, meaning if you create new users, if you change user data and group assignments, these are all controlled and automatically synchronized to your identity authentication user store. But it's still important to consider at this stage that your identities have no credentials. They have no login credentials. That the identity is stored here in the Identity Authentication Service database. Okay, so now let's take a look at the authentication flow. Step one, of course, user tries to access the target application. and is redirected in step 2 to the corresponding IDP, so the main IDP responsible for this application. Now, as you're an employee, the IAS knows that you are forwarded to the corporate IDP. However, you could be also a business partner or an external user, for example, external consultant. Then the authentication could also terminate here because, of course, you can create users here. You can upload users, you can upload CSVs, you can perform a self-service registration. So the authentication could theoretically terminate here, and you can go back and authenticate it purely with the IAS. That's often used for business-to-business scenarios where you don't want to map your guest users or your external users in your corporate system. So you can make use of this user store in the IAS as well. However, as an employee, you will in any case be forwarded to the corporate IDP. Yeah, and this is then often done based on rules, based on, for example, email domains. And of course, it's not only possible to connect with one, but also with multiple corporate IDPs. Step 4, at the end, this is really the authentication. So now, in the first step, the user has to authenticate, which enables him to make use, for example, of the well-known Microsoft login credentials. So he benefits from single sign-on, so you don't see any login screen. And if the authentication in step 4 on the Azure side was then successful, the identity provider, the Azure IDP in this case, issues a SAML token that really identifies the user, and this user is then propagated to the Identity Authentication Service in step 6. Meaning now there's a link between the identity from your corporate user store and to the identity in your Identity Authentication Service. So now in step 6, as the Identity Authentication Service knows about the user and the target application that the user wants to connect to, it can use or can issue the final single sign-on token containing all the required identifiers like unique user identifiers like the email address, maybe a personal number, employee number, whatever. Yeah? And this is then part of a final SAML assertion that will be issued in step 7. And this token could also provide certain other group information, group memberships or claims, which the target application can then evaluate to use it for authorization purpose, for example. So it's individually configurable for each single target application, and you can centrally control, let's say, access, and also decide for additional security factors, additional authentication on the Identity Authentication Service. So it's still a central system that at the end performs or has the access decision towards your application. Finally, with the SAML token issued from IAS, the user has at the end single sign-on to his business application, maybe Concur or even a other cloud application, or even your Fiori launchpad that is operated on premises. And this is really then in a complete, let's say, flow. Often this is totally transparent for the user. It's just clicking on the link and is directly authenticated. That's at the end the whole flow, and I hope it helps a little bit to understand the combination of IAS together with a already existing IDP that is often used and where often non-SAP applications are already connected, and also to somehow get rid of all this work where you have to exchange trusts between your various applications and the corporate IDP where you have different administrative stuff and that stuff. So it means really a lot of efforts, and with the IAS in between as a proxy, that really saves you lots of efforts when it comes to trust relationships with your cloud applications, and also provides you with a central system to ultimately control your access for your SAP on-premise and cloud applications. All right. All right, summary. I've talked about all of this as just for your reference in the slides. You will receive it after this session. And lastly, I want to talk about two questions. I know it's a lot of text here on this slide, but I just wanted to provide you everything on one slide. It's mainly about, is the cloud identity services available for free, and how to get such a identity authentication or maybe identity provisioning tenant. It's very often asked, and I have, from our experience, we also have a lot of confused customers that are really trying to get access to those tenants and have no luck. So often SAP has to be involved in that process. And first of all, let's start with the provisioning service, with the IPS. First of all, it's important to understand there is no longer a license available for IPS, so you can't really purchase the IPS separately. It is designed to support only applications where it comes bundled with. So tenant creation is typically done on one side. If you have a appropriate bundle for the BTP, for example, you can create a tenant using a self-service, only for the Neo environment, by the way, or it is automatically provided as part of the software as a service application delivery process. Bundle tenants are always limited. That's really important. Limited when it comes to supported source and target systems. And there is no longer a standalone system available. The only way to get such a full-featured IPS is by licensing the Cloud Identity Access Governance. That is more or less the most important information when it comes to the IPS. It's a little bit different for the Identity Authentication Service, because here tenant creation can be done via the business technology platform on a global account level, meaning if you have for example, a free tier account, you can easily create a Identity Authentication Service tenant for free. Also, it's of course part of some SAP software as a service applications that includes the Identity Authentication Service. And if you purchase, for example, the first one and SAP detects that your customer ID has no tenant available, it will set up the first tenant for you as part of the delivery process. It's always the case that a customer gets one tenant and he can request a second tenant or for test and QAS, whatever purposes, for free, so with no additional costs. And also very important, the Identity Authentication Service is never limited in its functionality. So there is no such bundle version or something like that. So you always have the full feature stack in every IIS tenant. Usage also does not require additional licenses, because I don't know how long, since some months or so, it's also allowed to connect with your on-premise SAP applications. Before it wasn't the case, so you can only use it for cloud applications. Now it's free to use for all SAP cloud solutions, for all SAP on-premise solutions, and also for SAP systems that you operate on the HANA Enterprise Cloud Hack. For these three use cases, there is no additional logins required that you have to purchase. However, you make sure that you really connect your applications and configure the correct application type to avoid that you have so-called bundled and charged logins and you receive really a correct bill from SAP. So by the end, as a summary, you can use it for free for all SAP applications, regardless of where they are operated, which is good because you have then the possibility to also centralize your on-premise systems to the identity authentication tenant. And also very important, this service together with the IPS also, they are designed to run once per landscape, meaning when a customer has multiple cloud products, they should be all integrated with the same authentication tenant. Best case, you have a separation between productive and test environments, but that's the best practice. So you should have 2 tenants at least, where you can then have all your applications connected with. If a customer wishes for whatever reason to have more than these 2 default tenants, you can also, of course, request an additional identity authentication or provisioning tenant that you can really a license via the SAP store based on a license agreement like pay as you go or the enterprise agreement with SAP. What's also important, maybe when it comes to non-SAP applications, there is something called third-party log-ons. This is really then when you connect a non-SAP application to your Identity Authentication Service as a service provider, then you really receive a bill when it comes to log-ons per user per day. Lastly, there is something called it's called the possibility that if you're really a globally acting company, like you have licensed SAP products in different regions in the world, it could be possible that such companies really receive a dedicated identity authentication tenant for another region. So that's could be one reason why you have multiple tenants. And also with some SaaS applications like SuccessFactors, it's often the case that you have a pre-delivered identity authentication service. So it's quite often the case that you will have multiple tenants and you have to make sure that you really consolidate your applications to two central tenants and to really have a better overview about your authentication processes. Also, it's interesting to take a look at Matthias Kempfer blog here that I have linked to you when it comes to these information about the licensing topic, because there he's talking about the BTP service description guide, which is more or less the official document, the legal language that you need to know related to licensing in this space. All right, I hope this answers those questions sufficiently. If not, please let me know. I think I got it all. So Mike, what's going on in the chat box? Do we have any questions?
No, nothing that has not been answered yet. So apparently you covered everything that our audience wanted to know.
Well, that's great. So
there was only one concern, not necessarily related to the content, but more to the organizational part. So it seems like whenever I start the broadcast and I start talking immediately, go to webinar actually takes a while to give its introductional, speech or whatever. So some of my some of the things that I said initially were cut off, but I don't think there was anything super critical. Just a couple of housekeeping things that the webinar is going to be recorded. You'll get a link to a recording, etc. So I hope nothing major got cut off. But I think next time for the next webinar, we'll have to wait a little bit longer after pressing the start broadcast button before we start talking. So to make sure nothing gets cut off.
All right. Well, perfect. Then I have to say thank you for your attention. And as I said, if you have any further questions, please get in touch with me related to this topic. And yeah, looking forward to see you all in the next session.
All right, very good. Thank you, Carsten. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us. Hope we see you next week, I guess it is, for the next Ask the Expert session. Please don't forget to submit the questions up front so we have ample of time to prepare, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.